unfold.
$40. It's a number that feels historical, right? Like it's something tucked away in the past. But the reality is that the history we're discussing today is very much a current event.
It is.
We are heading into April 2026, which marks 4 decades since the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. And, this isn't just about remembrance.
No, it's a necessary and frankly an alarming status update on a catastrophe that is still very much ongoing.
That's it, exactly. Our sources for this deep dive, which are part of this huge 40-year retrospective on the disaster, they all stress that this story, it isn't just one moment in 1987.
That's right. It's about the decades-long persistence of what the research defines as the invisible enemy.
That's a really powerful guiding theme. And our mission today is to use this deep dive to look beyond that basic timeline, to really dissect the tragedy through the convergence of 4 specific unseen adversaries.
And it's a framework that you really need to understand the full picture. Back then, the first enemy was the obvious one, hiding in plain sight. The imperceptible lethality of ionizing radiation itself.
Right. And the second was this systemic force, the opaque, rigid Soviet bureaucracy.
A belief system defined by self-serving denial and this notion of its own infallibility.
And then there's the third enemy, which was the engineering time bomb. The insidious, built-in design flaws of the RBMK reactor, flaws that made a catastrophe, well, almost inevitable under certain conditions.
And the fourth. This is the one that makes the 40th anniversary so profoundly disturbing. It's the contemporary geopolitical instability, the return of actual war that has completely compromised the site's fragile containment.
So we're going to reconstruct the physics of the explosion, explore the impossible heroism of the first responders, and crucially, provide a definitive status update on the zone as of 2026.
And that includes some genuinely alarming developments that occurred as recently as February 2025.
Which moves Chernobyl from a history lesson straight back into the realm of immediate global concern.
It absolutely does. We are going to chart the path from this Soviet utopian dream straight to the cold, hard reality of today's broken containment. And to understand the depth of that betrayal, you have to start at the beginning, in the dream city of Pripyat.
To really appreciate the magnitude of the fall, you first have to understand just how high the aspirations were. Pripyat, founded on February 4th, 1970, was the 9th Soviet Atomgrad.
And in Atomgrad, it wasn't just a city where workers lived. It was an active ideological statement, a planned, realized utopia for the nuclear elite.
The sources really emphasize the stark contrast between Pripyat and, the rest of the Soviet Union at the time.
Right, during the era of stagnation. While the rest of the country was dealing with chronic deficits, crumbling infrastructure, Pripyat was deliberately made a showcase, a vision of modernity and socialist abundance.
And the aesthetic details are just so symbolic. The city was designed by Maria Protsenko, and despite the brutalist architecture of the apartment blocks, the 160 of them, they really tried to soften it.
It was known as the City of Roses, wasn't it?
Yeah, over 33,000 rose bushes planted along these manicured streets. It was an intentional attempt to humanize the cold, concrete face of Soviet technology.
And this wasn't a city of aging party bureaucrats. The demographics were key. It was a young, highly skilled population of engineers, physicists, technicians.
The average age was only 26.
Just 26 years old. They were the intellectual vanguard, drawn there by premium wages, spacious modern housing, and just the intellectual vibrancy that came with being at the cutting edge of Soviet science.
It represented the very best life the Soviet system could offer.
No question.
Let's ground this with some specifics from January 1st, 1986. The population was 49,400 people, housed in over 13,000 apartments.
And the social infrastructure was, enviable. 15 kindergartens, 5 schools for 11,000 students, the Palace of Culture energetic, the famous Azure swimming pool.
And the commerce was crucial to this utopian image. They had 25 stores and malls, including the Raduga department store.
Which is where residents got access to the deficit goods. High-quality meat, fresh produce, consumer electronics, things that were just unobtainable for the average Soviet citizen.
Yeah.
This access was an explicit privilege of living in the Atomgrad.
But this prosperity had a hidden side, right? A dual nature that really mirrored the secrecy around the RBMK reactor itself.
Yes, the Jupiter factory, on the city's outskirts. Officially, it produced tape recorders and household appliances.
A complete facade.
A complete facade. The sources confirm its real purpose. It employed over 3,000 highly skilled technicians whose real task was manufacturing critical components for the Soviet military-industrial complex. Flight recorders, military computers, all sorts of sensitive tech.
So the whole city, designed for peaceful energy, was tied to the highest levels of Soviet military secrecy.
Inextricably linked. Which brings us to that first invisible enemy. The deep-seated illusion of the peaceful atom, Murney atom.
The whole psychological landscape of Pripyat was defined by this almost religious, unshakable faith in nuclear safety.
Catastrophe wasn't just unlikely, it was considered philosophically impossible within the Soviet system. The retrospective analysis confirms Valery Legasov's grim assessment. The entire Soviet nuclear establishment had cultivated this pervasive culture of self-proclaimed infallibility.
They saw catastrophic failure as a weakness of, inferior Western designs. The RBMK, in their minds, was robust, reliable, and fundamentally safe.
And that arrogance fueled this profound complacency. You had residents fishing in the warm cooling pond right next to the reactor.
Swimming in the river downstream.
Exactly. They saw the plant as this benevolent provider, this machine that gave them their high standard of living, not a threat that demanded any kind of vigilance.
It was a cultural dismissal of risk.
Completely. They were told, officially and unofficially, that the design was so simple, so reliable, there was no risk. The concept of an explosion was just dismissed as Western propaganda.
And nothing illustrates the collapse of that illusion, the collision of the dream and the reality, quite like the Pripyat amusement park.
Ah, the Ferris wheel.
The iconic image, frozen in time, but the true story of its fate is just so much more macabre.
The persistent urban myth is that the park never opened. It was scheduled for a grand opening on May 1st. For the May Day celebrations.
But the darker historical reality, supported by multiple credible witness accounts in the sources, shows just how desperate the institutional denial was.
They opened it early.
The city authorities, almost shockingly, opened the rides, the Ferris wheel, the bumper cars, the paratrooper ride, on the morning of April 27th, 1986.
The day after the core had exploded and was burning. And critically, hours before the city was finally evacuated.
So wait, they were actively using the park to entertain children while the explosion site was venting massive amounts of radionuclides into the air?
They were. The sources confirm it was a calculated act to distract the populace, to maintain the illusion of calm and routine. Just try to imagine that scene.
It's horrifying.
The city is silent except for the laughter and screams from the rides, while this invisible radioactive haze, particularly laden with volatile iodine-131, was saturating the air.
It just speaks volumes about the bureaucracy, that they prioritize the illusion of order over the safety of their own children.
Hundreds of kids and families exposed to massive, unnecessary doses of radionuclides that morning. The invisible enemy was given a clear path straight into the thyroids of the city's youngest residents.
So we move from the systemic failure of denial to the technical failure that defined the tragedy. The perfect city built right next to a machine that contained a fatal trap, the RBMK 1000. The second invisible enemy.
The RBMK, or high-power channel-type reactor, was a uniquely Soviet design. It was fundamentally different from the light water reactors, or LWRs, preferred in the West.
And it was fatal compromise, wasn't it? Driven by Soviet needs, the ability to breed weapons-grade plutonium while also generating electricity.
And that compromise introduced a catastrophic, inherent instability.
Okay, let's drill down on the physics here. For those of us who aren't nuclear physicists, let's talk about the positive void coefficient.
Right, so first let's define the roles. In any reactor, you need a moderator to slow down neutrons so they can cause fission, and you need a coolant to remove heat. In Western LWRs, ordinary water does both jobs.
Okay, that makes sense.
So if the water in a Western reactor boils and turns to steam, that's the void, it's lost as both coolant and moderator. The loss of moderation is dominant, so the reaction slows down and power drops.
That's the natural break you mentioned, passive safety.
Exactly. It has a negative void coefficient. But the RBMK was different. It used 1,700 tons of massive graphite blocks as the moderator, which is an incredibly efficient facilitator of fission. The water running through the channels was primarily the coolant, but it also acted as the primary neutron absorber.
So the balance is completely flipped. The graphite is the facilitator and the water is the inhibitor.
Precisely. Now, if that water boils and turns to steam, creating a void, what happens? The absorber is removed, but the highly efficient graphite moderator is still there.
So fewer neutrons are absorbed.
Which means the fission rate accelerates dramatically. Heat increases rapidly, which creates more steam, It's a positive feedback loop. The reactor essentially runs away from itself.
And this instability was particularly acute at low power level.
Which is precisely where the crew was operating that night. It was a ticking bomb.
So the positive void coefficient was the charge built into the machine, but the control rod design was the actual detonator. This is the flaw known as the control rod tip effect.
It's engineering negligence that borders on the criminal. The RBMK had 211 control rods intended for emergency shutdown, filled with boron carbide, a powerful neutron absorber.
But they had a flaw.
Fatal one. To ease their movement and reduce costs, they attached a 4.5-meter section of pure graphite, the displacer, to the bottom of the boron carbide section.
So when the rods were fully withdrawn, the space where the graphite tips would eventually go was filled with water, the neutron absorber.
Now, picture the situation. The core is already on the brink of instability. When the emergency shutdown button, EC5, was pressed, the rods began to descend. But for the first 4 to 5 seconds,
the graphite displacer entered the core before the boron carbide absorber.
yes, it replaced the water, the absorber, with graphite, the facilitator.
Wait, so pressing the emergency stop button, AZ5, for the first few critical seconds, guaranteed that the system added positive reactivity. It was an accelerator disguised as a brake.
That is the horrifying truth of the design. It guaranteed a prompt critical excursion in an already sensitive low-power core. It was the design's perfect storm, built right into the safety system itself.
And yet, there were bureaucratic and procedural defenses that should have prevented this. That brings us to the operating reactivity margin, the ORM.
The ORM was the measure of the reactor's capacity to shut down quickly, controlled by the number of rods remaining in the core. Regulations mandated a minimum ORM of 15 rods to ensure safe power distribution and counter those void instabilities.
Dropping below 15 was a massive safety violation.
An explicit, massive violation. But the operators that night were fighting the core's sluggishness, which required them to withdraw more and more control rods.
Ultimately eliminating their last line of defense.
They absolutely dismantled their own defense. To fight what's known as reactor poison, they just kept withdrawing rods, reducing the ORM to a dangerously low level, approximately 6 to 8 rods. They had, knowingly or unknowingly, placed the reactor into a regime where its inherent instability could not be counteracted by any safety system. They'd turned it into a loaded weapon with a hair trigger.
This inherent technical flaw then meets the third invisible enemy, the crushing weight of Soviet bureaucracy and production pressure. Let's look at the 24 hours leading up to the explosion.
The entire chain of catastrophe was set in motion by a single deeply ironic event, a scheduled safety test.
A safety test.
A safety test. They needed to prove that if external power failed, the spinning inertia of the main steam turbine could generate enough electricity for 45 to 60 seconds to run the main circulating pumps. This would bridge the gap until the backup diesel generators started up.
And this test, it had already failed multiple times before, so the pressure to get it done and sign off on the plant was immense.
Which is why they were willing to overlook so many critical safety steps. The timeline of degradation starts early on April 25. At 14:00, the first major violation, the emergency core cooling system, the ECCS, was manually disconnected.
Why would they do that?
Engineers feared it might flood the core and ruin the test measurements. It was a direct violation of regulatory procedure.
And at the exact same moment, the Kiev grid controller orders a 9-hour halt on the power reduction?
Right. They needed the 50% output for the afternoon industry peak. And that delay, holding the reactor steady at 50% power for 9 hours, was absolutely critical. This is where the xenon trap gets set.
Xenon-135, the reactor poison.
It's a byproduct of fission, a potent neutron absorber. At full power, the heat is so high that the Xenon-135 burns off as quickly as it's produced.
But operating at intermediate power allows it to build up.
Exactly. It poisons the core, making it sluggish and resistant to fission. To counteract this, operators were forced to withdraw more and more control rods, further eroding their ORM, just to keep the reaction stable at 50%.
So the bureaucracy's delay was literally destroying the reactor's last line of defense.
It is a slow-motion disaster, which then accelerated catastrophically after midnight on April 26 with the shift change.
A terrible confluence of events.
At midnight, the night shift took over. This included Leonid Toptunov, the senior reactor control engineer. He was only 25 and had a mere 3 months of operational experience in that critical role. He was supervised by shift foreman Alexander Akimov. They were an inexperienced crew facing an already unstable core.
And then came the critical error that sent the power plummeting.
At 00.28 during a transfer procedure, either an error or an instrument failure caused Toptunov to lose control, and the power dropped from 1,600 megawatts down to just 30 megawatts, virtually zero.
At which point the core was massively fatally poisoned by xenon-135.
Which should have been the end of it. The procedure mandated an immediate shutdown. That was the point of no return.
But this is where the production pressure, embodied by Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyalov, overrules all safety concerns.
Dyalov was notorious for his aggressive bullying style. He was desperate to get this long-delayed test completed.
So, under his supervision, the inexperienced crew struggled to raise the power, essentially driving a massively unstable reactor back up the cliff face.
They fought for half an hour, finally stabilizing power at only about 200 megawatts by 1 a.m. This was far below the 700 megawatt safety floor. But Dyalov was determined to proceed. The psychological environment was one of absolute subordination. No one was going to question him.
The Scala computer must have been screaming warnings by this point.
It was. The computer was tracking the ORM, and it was displaying a catastrophic reading. By ZOR 1.22, when they were operating with an ORM of roughly 8 rods, the computer recommended an immediate mandatory shutdown. Dyalov either ignored the printout or dismissed it. The test had to proceed.
The loaded gun was cocked.
And we now enter the forensic analysis of the final seconds. The terminal sequence that began just after 1.23 a.m.
The test begins at 1.23.04. The turbine stop valves close, the main pumps begin to coast down, slowing the flow of coolant.
As that coolant flow rapidly decreases, the water temperature rises. At 1.23.4, the core channels reach boiling point. Boiling starts at the bottom of the core, precisely where the control rod tips were set to cause maximum damage.
And the positive void coefficient engages immediately.
Immediately and fully. Steam replaces water, reactivity spikes, heat skyrockets, creating even more steam. Power begins its rapid, unstoppable, exponential rise.
And then the highly debated action, the pressing of the AZ5 scram button at 1.23.40.
This is a complex historical debate. The popular narrative suggests panic, but expert analysis, including Dyatlab's own accounts, argues it was the planned conclusion to the test, initiated just before the massive power excursion registered.
But regardless of the motivation, the result was the same.
Correct. The instant 𝐏𝐿𝐃𝐂𝐓 pressed that button, all 211 control rods began to descend. This triggered the fatal control rod tip effect. The graphite displacers injected massive positive reactivity into the most sensitive region of the core.
The reaction must have been instantaneous and violent.
Overwhelmingly fast.
Yep.
At 1.23.43, the power alarm screamed. Power jumped wildly to 530 megawatts in seconds, then higher. The heat surge was so colossal that at 1.23.44, the structural integrity failed. Fuel channels deformed, warped violently.
The control rods jammed.
They jammed solid at only 2.5 meters in insertion, stuck exactly at the height of maximum positive reactivity injection. They didn't just fail, they maximized the danger.
Wow.
At 1.23.45, the core went prompt critical. The fission rate surged uncontrollably, spiking to an estimated 30,000 thermal megawatts, 10 times the reactor's maximum capacity. The coolant instantly vaporized into an explosion of superheated steam.
That massive pressure had to go somewhere.
It did. The first explosion was a colossal steam blast that hydraulically blew the 1,000-ton steel and concrete biological shield, Elena, straight off the reactor vessel, severing all 1,661 pressure tubes.
The core was open to the sky.
Moments later, a second, more powerful explosion, likely a hydrogen detonation. Witnesses described this sound not as a sharp bang, but as a deep, seismic thud, like a human moan, followed by a shockwave that rattled windows for miles. The roof of the reactor building was gone.
The mechanical shock was over, but the work of the first invisible enemy, the radiation, was just beginning. The moment the core was exposed, survivors witnessed a terrifying spectacle: the ionized air glow.
It's crucial we distinguish this from the popular misconception of Cherenkov radiation. That's the blue light from particles moving faster than light in water. This was different.
Right. This was the air itself glowing.
The exposed, burning core was emitting such an intense, colossal flux of gamma rays that it stripped electrons from the nitrogen and oxygen molecules in the atmosphere right above the reactor.
A literal column of blue-violet light, a searchlight of death.
And the first people to run towards that light were the fire crews. The heroism is just... it's difficult to overstate.
We're talking about the men from Paramilitary Fire Station No. 2 under Lieutenant Pravik and the Pripyat Brigade under Lieutenant Kibinok. They arrived at 1.28 only minutes after the explosion.
Their mission was the roof of the turbine hall, which was ablaze with oil and bitumen. They fought those fires for hours, with no radiological protection, wearing only standard fire suits.
And they were completely unaware that the debris they were walking on and kicking aside was fragments of the radioactive graphite core itself.
The sources estimate the radiation levels on that roof were astronomically high, likely 20,000 to 30,000 roentgens per hour. A lethal dose in minutes. Their sacrifice was immediate and total.
The clinical timeline of acute radiation syndrome, ARS, particularly in the harrowing case of firefighter Vasily Ignatenko, shows the precise cruel mechanism of this invisible enemy.
It's an internal betrayal of the body. Walk us through the stages because it really highlights how insidious radiation is.
Well, immediately following exposure, you have the prodromal phase. Violent, uncontrollable vomiting, a crushing headache, and this distinct, lingering metallic taste.
Then comes the latent phase, the biological lie that deceives both the victim and the medical staff, the walking ghost phase.
Exactly. Ignatenko and others appeared to recover. They felt well enough to joke and play cards in the hospital in Moscow. But internally, the damage was irreversible.
The massive doses of radiation had completely destroyed their bone marrow, eliminating the body's ability to generate immune cells and regenerate tissue. The body was lying to him.
And when it could no longer maintain that illusion, the manifest illness phase kicked in.
Cellular regeneration failure became absolute. His skin rapidly turned black, a nuclear sunburn, and began peeling off in sheets. Internal organs hemorrhaged. His immune system collapsed. He died 14 days later, on May 13, 1986.
And because of the radionuclides still active in his body, he had to be buried in a zinc coffin, which was soldered shut. He was treated as highly radioactive waste.
And while this impossible heroism was unfolding, the second invisible enemy, the Soviet denial machine, was in absolute control.
The denial was just monumental. Inside the control room, Akamov and Dyatlov, despite seeing the devastation, refused to believe the RBMK could have exploded. They insisted the reactor was intact.
And ordered futile attempts to pump water into the core, which only made things worse, sweeping radioactive material into the lower levels of the building.
And the ultimate price for this institutional denial was paid by the 49,000 residents of Pripyat.
Pripyat was left open for 36 agonizing hours. Think about that. A burning core kilometers away, and life continued. Children played outside, weddings were celebrated.
Well, iodine-131 was being absorbed, concentrating directly in the thyroid glands of the population, especially the children.
The denial lasted so long because of systemic disbelief. The core could not explode, and the fear of reporting a disaster that contradicted the state's narrative. The evacuation didn't start until 2 p.m. on April 27, when radioactive clouds began drifting toward Kiev.
By then, the invisible enemy had infiltrated the bodies of the entire population. All it took was 36 hours of official silence.
Once the scale of the catastrophe became undeniable, largely after radiation spikes were detected in Sweden, the Soviet state mobilized the liquidation.
An unprecedented effort, drafting over 600,000 personnel into the cleanup zone. An effort defined by desperate measures and extraordinary sacrifice.
The most immediate and dangerous task was clearing the debris on the roof of Reactor 3, right next to the open crater. This area was covered in massive, highly radioactive chunks of graphite and fuel.
And the initial solution was technological?
Which failed. The Soviet STR-1 rover and the German Joker robot both failed almost instantly. The radiation fried their electronics.
So technology failed, and they were forced to revert to the only functional solution, human beings. The 3,828 soldiers known as Biorobots.
General Nikolai Tarakanov was in charge. The sources provide these vivid details. The soldiers were given minimal protection, usually just lead sheets draped over them, heavy cod pieces and aprons.
And their mission was unbelievably simple and sacrificial.
Run onto the roof, shovel one spade load of graphite debris into the crater, and run back off. They adhered to a strict time limit, 45 to 90 seconds. They were human machines, moving radioactive waste, knowing every second was a fraction of their life.
General Tarkanov's interaction with them is so moving. He was direct and honest.
He told one group, "You are the last 3,000 men we have to do this," acknowledging the monumental risk. And the standard response from the soldiers, I served the Soviet Union, was an understanding that they were serving as human shields.
The other critical front involved the molten core material, the corium. There was this existential fear that it might melt through the foundation and contact the groundwater.
Which would have caused a massive secondary steam explosion, a China syndrome that could have contaminated the entire Dnipro River system, the drinking water for millions.
The solution was to mobilize the coal miners.
400 miners from Tula and the Donbass. They dug a tunnel beneath the reactor to install a liquid nitrogen heat exchanger. They worked in suffocating heat, often stripped to the waist. They completed the tunnel in a grueling month.
But their effort has this ambiguous weight to it. The heat exchanger was technically unnecessary in the end.
That's the moral ambiguity of sacrifice. The 𝐏𝐻𝐃 cooled on its own, but the sources stress that given the uncertainty of the time, their effort was absolutely vital. They acted to prevent a potential global catastrophe based on the worst-case scenario. Their heroism lies in that willingness to risk everything.
We should also use this segment to push back against some of the persistent myths that have grown around this tragedy.
Definitely. Let's start with the Bridge of Death. The urban legend claims 100% of the spectators who gathered on the railway bridge died. While radiation levels were elevated, there's no definitive evidence to support a 100% mortality rate. It's an exaggeration.
And the dramatic story of the Suicide Squad divers.
That narrative is demonstrably false. The three men, Ananenko, Bespalov, and Baranov, were absolute heroes, but they survived the immediate aftermath. Baranov died in 2005, and the others were confirmed alive as recently as 2019. Their heroism was genuine, but their fate wasn't that immediate media-fueled tragedy.
And finally, the helicopter crash.
That iconic crash actually occurred months later, in October 1986. It was caused by the helicopter hitting a crane cable, not by radiation effects on the night of the explosion. Dispelling these myths is crucial for understanding the true historical reality.
So as we transition into the 40th anniversary, the Chernobyl exclusion zone, the CEZ, presents this staggering paradox. It remains a site of profound physical hazard, yet it's also become one of Europe's most successful, albeit accidental, nature reserves.
The persistent physical hazard is epitomized by the elephant's foot. This massive formation of corium, this lava-like mixture of fuel and concrete, located beneath Reactor 4.
In 1986, it was radiating 10,000 roentgens per hour, lethal in minutes. What's its status today in 2026?
It's cooled significantly. Its surface has reacted with moisture and air, turning into a dusty, sand-like material. While its intensity is orders of magnitude less, it remains a serious long-term threat. If that mass were disturbed by seismic activity or military action, it could generate highly radioactive dust. The original core is patient and persistent.
But the flip side is the natural recovery. The profound absence of humans for 40 years has allowed the CEZ to flourish.
Which leads to what researchers call the wolf paradox. Wildlife has surged. The zone now hosts thriving populations of lynx, brown bears, bison, and Przewalski's horses, and wolf density is 7 times higher than in uncontaminated reserves.
7 times higher! How is that possible? This is where the biological insights from 2024-2025 research become so compelling.
They do. Recent research has found that Chernobyl's wolves have developed significant genetic alterations in their immune systems, changes that mimic those seen in human cancer patients undergoing high-dose radiation therapy.
So they're essentially developing cancer-resistant genes in real time.
That's the evolutionary interpretation. These genes, which seem to protect cell regeneration and suppress tumor development, are now the focus of intense global medical research. The species has begun to adapt.
So this doesn't mean the radiation isn't dangerous. What's the ultimate insight here?
It delivers a chilling realization. Species are thriving in the CEZ, not because the radiation is harmless, but because the pressure of permanent human habitation, urban sprawl, agriculture, poaching, is demonstrably more destructive to biodiversity than chronic ionizing radiation.
We were the greater threat.
In the long term, yes. The worst enemy, the human presence, is gone, and nature has seized the opportunity. It's a profound, if dark, insight into our own impact.
And that brings us to the fourth and perhaps most urgent invisible enemy, geopolitical instability. The 40th anniversary is completely overshadowed by the return of war, which has shattered 3 decades of hard-won safety protocols.
The commitment to safety was anchored in the new Safe Confinement, the NSC. This colossal, arch-shaped steel structure costing 1.5 billion euros was completed in 2016. It was designed to provide a sealed, hermetic environment for 100 years.
A guarantee of containment, a guarantee that was severely tested by the 2022 Russian invasion. But the worst development came much later, in early 2025.
The sources confirmed the event on February 14, 2025. On that night, the NSC was struck by a Russian Geran-2, a 𝐏𝐻𝐃-type kamikaze drone, an unprecedented direct physical attack on the primary containment structure.
What was the extent of the damage to this multi-billion euro safety device?
The drone blast created a hole about 15 square meters in size, penetrating both the outer and inner cladding of the arch. The impact also ignited flammable protective membranes, causing a localized fire that smoldered for weeks.
And the official assessment following this attack confirms the worst fears.
It does. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi confirmed that due to the breach, the NSC had lost its primary safety functions, including the confinement capability. The crucial hermetic seal was broken. The multi-billion-euro containment structure is no longer fully contained.
So as of 2026, the entire containment system is definitively compromised. What does this breach mean for the future of the site?
It's catastrophic. It allows moisture rain, snow, condensation to enter freely. This dramatically accelerates the corrosion of the unstable 1986 sarcophagus hidden inside and the internal steel beams of the NSC itself. The entire structure is deteriorating at an accelerated rate.
And the long-term plan to dismantle the old shelter is obviously stalled.
Indefinitely suspended. While there are emergency funds for temporary repairs, full restoration is impossible while the airspace remains contested and the surrounding territory is mined.
So let's summarize the current containment status. The 1986 sarcophagus is unstable and corroding.
The NSC is compromised and breached. The exclusion zone itself is an active war zone.
The door on hell, sealed by billions of euros and decades of effort, has been forced ajar by human conflict. The invisible enemy has been given fresh purchase, not through a reactor flaw, but through political failure.
This whole journey, charting the path from the false utopia of Pripyat in 1986 to the fractured containment of 2026, it shows a chilling evolution of the invisible enemy.
It began as the enemy of physics and institutional secrecy. Today, it's the enemy of entropy, accelerated corrosion, and devastating geopolitical conflict.
The core takeaway from this retrospective is clear. Chernobyl is not a historical event with a neat conclusion. It is an ongoing process demanding perpetual human vigilance.
The source material provides the most chilling comparison to put that risk into perspective. The half-life of plutonium-239 is 24,000 years.
The half-life of human political stability is demonstrably considerably shorter. That fragility is the ultimate enduring risk.
The liquidators of 1986 sacrificed their lives to close the door on hell, believing they had secured centuries of safety.
And the 2025 drone strike proved that even the most technologically advanced, multi-billion-dollar containment system cannot protect us from the simple volatility of human conflict. Containment requires peace.
And that lesson applies far beyond the exclusion zone. The peaceful atom is only peaceful if the world around it remains so. The invisible enemy waits, patient and enduring, ready to exploit the cracks in our armor, cracks that we ourselves create.
So this raises a final, crucial, provocative thought for you to mull over. If the events of the last few years show us that we cannot guarantee the stability of governance for even a short century, what does that imply for the ethical responsibility of building and managing global, long-term hazards, nuclear waste facilities, deep geological storage vaults that require uninterrupted stability for thousands upon thousands of years? The clock is ticking on more than just the site of Chernobyl.